Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Cambridge University Press Linguistics webinar. My name is Rebecca Fletcher, a marketing executive with Cambridge University Press, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professors Joyce Bruhn de Garavito and John Schwieter to discuss their new textbook, Introducing Linguistics, published in January 2021. Just a few housekeeping points before we start. You have all joined in listen-only mode. However, you can submit questions throughout the event in the chat box. We encourage you all to do so, and Joyce and John will answer as many as they can after their introduction. A recording of the event will be emailed to you afterwards, along with a link where you can find out more about introducing linguistics and request an examination copy. Joyce Bruhn de Garavito is Professor Emeritus of Hispanic Studies and Linguistics at Western University, an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, and the recipient of the Western University Pleva Award for Excellence in Teaching and the Graham and Gail Wright Distinguished Scholar Award. John Schwieter is Professor of Spanish and Linguistics and Faculty of Arts Teaching Scholar at Wilfrid Laurier University, where he directs the Language Acquisition, Multilingualism and Cognition Laboratory and Bilingualism Matters at Laurier. He is the executive editor of the book series Bilingual Processing and Acquisition, published by Benjamins, and co-editor of the Cambridge Elements in Second Language Acquisition. I'm very much looking forward to hearing their presentation today and their responses to your questions. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Joyce and John.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you all for joining us today. It's amazing that this is finally released, and we're super excited that to see this finally in print. So I want to start us off by reading just one paragraph of the preface of the book, and hopefully will perk your interest even further. Here it goes. Have you ever wondered how you learned your language as a baby? Perhaps a better question is whether you remember doing so at all. How is it possible and more difficult to learn another language later in life? And why is this second language often less native-like than the mother tongue? How do we use language creatively to negotiate meanings in different stages of our life? You may not realize it, well, you may realize it, this particular crowd, but some may not realize it. But language is involved in everything we do. It truly is what separates us from other animals that have far less sophisticated ways of communicating compared to humans. Linguistics, the study of language, is interested in these and many other related questions. So in a few minutes, I'm going to hand it over to Joyce to talk about the first half of the book. But first, I'd like to say a few things about what both of us are very excited about within the book, and these are the special pedagogical features that a reader would find throughout the book, and we think they make the book unique, appealing, and accessible to all readers. And I want to tell you about those now. So the first, throughout the chapters, every page or two, there are brief pause and reflect boxes that encourage readers to take a moment, contemplate what they've just read, or practice what they have just learned. Sometimes these boxes ask readers to draw on personal experiences, and other times they provide a much needed step-by-step practice, maybe of drawing a syntactic tree, of what was just learned before moving on. And we all know, if you've taught it before, it's very important to have this step-by-step learning procedure. Here's an example from chapter 9, Sociolinguistics. Pause and reflect 9.12. Imagine you have been given the responsibility of reviving a language that has died. What kinds of things would you do to ensure your revival efforts were successful? Another one of the features that we really like and enjoyed putting it into the book are called Eyes on World Languages boxes. These boxes introduce readers to how other languages, other than English, work and function across the globe. The information in these boxes are directly related to the text around them, and they encourage readers to think about how different or similar languages function compared to the ones that they speak. Here's an example from chapter 14, Psycholinguistics. It's called Eyes on World Languages, Processing American Sign Language. Do you think that American Sign Language shows grammar in the signs that it uses? If you said yes, you are right. In fact, ASL has a rich use of morphology and syntax. For example, in the phrase, tell me, the movement of the sign tell is towards the signer, whereas in the phrase tell you, the movement is toward the addressee. In other words, the marking of these object pronouns is built in the motion of the sign itself. Quite a bit of research has compared and contrasted the processing of ASL and English, spoken English. It is generally accepted that American Sign Language is a separate language from English. However, there are many similarities that exist in terms of their grammatical organization. And you will read more about those later in the chapter. Another pedagogical feature here that I say is peppered throughout the chapters are these little tiny linguistic, well, they're not tiny, but they're little boxes called linguistics tidbits. And they offered situations that are similar to what you may have heard of in the question, did you know that? Here's an example from chapter 2, Phonetics, which is a really nice contemporary example of how language has changed over the last 20 or 30 years. Linguistics tidbits, vocal fry. Vocal fry, or creaky voice, was originally associated with voice pathology. That is to say, people who had disordered speech. But it has recently become common in the speech of young women in Canada and the United States. And it's kind of this scratchy sound. You may have heard it, and here's an example coming. It has received a great deal of attention in popular and academic press as well, as seen in examples and in videos. There's an example video here of Kim Kardashian and Katy Perry, who very frequently use this vocal fry in their speech. Creaky voice or vocal fry in itself does not carry any social value. As discussed above, there are languages that use creaky voice as part of their sound system, in which no social value is attached to it at all. However, in English, the use of creaky voice can carry negative social associations, suggesting that it is not valued when used by women. And it goes on a few more sentences. And it ends with, do you know anyone who uses vocal fry? Do any males you know use this pattern in their speech? And a few last things before I hand over to Joyce. Like many textbooks, key concepts throughout the chapters are bolded and then are defined in the glossary. And each chapter will end with about 15 or so exercises that are designed to help apply what has been learned throughout that chapter. The answers to those exercises are available for instructors online. And the last thing I want to mention before I turn it over to Joyce is the book's website. The book's accompanying website is www.cambridge.org/introducing-linguistics. There are three brief chapters, about 3,000 words each, that can be found on that site. If you go there now, you don't even have to buy the textbook. Anyone can go there now and read those 3 chapters. It's about 3,000 words each. One is on animal communication and language, one is on computational linguistics, and one is on English varieties outside of North America. These chapters follow the exact same pedagogical features you see in the textbook. So they have the eyes on world languages, pause and reflex, etc. Also on the book's website are additional short readings, 500 words, sometimes 1,000 words, on topics that are related to each chapter that students who are interested in reading more about a specific topic that is mentioned in the text can go to and read about. These are written by the same authors as Joyce and I are as well, co-authors of the book, as the chapters themselves. For example, chapter 1, if you go on the book's website, you would find that delving deeper for chapter 1 talks about the evolution and emergence of human language. Also, for instructors, on that website, you will find PowerPoint lectures for each chapter, answers to those end of chapter exercises I talked about before, and a multiple choice test bank with answers for each chapter. So I've been doing a lot of talking. I'm going to hand it over to Joyce now. We're going to do a little bit of content talking about, she can address the first half of the book, and then I'll take a look at the second half of the book. Joyce, off to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being here. It is very exciting for us, as John said, to have finally finished it and to see that people are actually interested. So, the chapters are organized in different parts. So the first chapter is introducing linguistics, and that one is independent. But then we have the sound system, structure and meaning, and classification of languages. So I'll go over the first four parts of the book briefly, because I don't want to tire you out. So the introduction, they were three main points that we tried to make. The first one is that linguistics is a science, and that means that it's a process of discovery and not a set of truths that we have to accept or believe in. That for us is very important, not just for linguistics, but actually for part of the students' education in general. Lots of problems would be avoided if that were understood. Linked to that, I would like to mention that one of the exercises at the end of the chapter asks, sets out a situation in which there's a murder and the detectives come and there's a bit of an investigation. And so the students are asked to determine which is the detective's theory of the case, which are his hypotheses, and what is the evidence found. So this is not directly linked to linguistics, but it does underline the fact that science proceeds in a similar way in all aspects of life. The other point that this chapter emphasizes is the difference between language and communication, and this links to the chapter on animal communication. And finally, we go over briefly, well, not clearly, over the main theories regarding language, including generative linguistics of Chomsky on one hand, and more functional approaches such as Tomasello on the other hand. We try to be very even-handed about this without taking sides. And the chapter ends with reasons why you should study linguistics and language, and what you can do with it later in life, what professions it will help you with. And so, and then there's a series of exercises that's in all the chapters. Then the second part is sound, which will include phonetics and phonology, which is as traditional. The phonetics chapter has a series of audios that the students can listen to the sounds in different languages. And it includes how speech is produced and also how speech is heard. In other words, articulatory phonetics and an introduction to acoustic phonetics. Of course, it has IPA, again linked to sound files, and it's besides the exercises at the end of the chapter, the website includes more transcription exercises because there never seem to be enough of those. The acoustic phonetics, for example, has both articulatory and acoustic have illustrations of the vocal cords, illustrations of spectrograms, etc. The next chapter in the same part in sound is phonology, and that begins by comparing phonology and phonetics and pointing out what the differences and similarities between the two are. And then, of course, it goes through the concepts that are basic, such as the phoneme and minimal pairs and complementary distribution and free variation. And the free variation is linked to the delving deeper on the online, where we look at the free variation is called that, but it's not really free because it's external factors that determine the variation. So we give the example of Laboff's famous study on the Arles dialect in the region of New York. And we show that actually the educational level, the socioeconomic level, gender, etc., can all be, and context, of course, can all be factors that determine variation in the production of certain phonemes. And we go into natural plastic, and of course, the features, how phonemes can be even more reduced to a number of features. And example, we take the time to explain why this is important, because it allows us to generalize, and it shows how, for example, we play a game of 20 questions in which the answer, I think, is the phoneme P, and after 4 questions, is it syllabic, is it consonantal, is it sonorant? 4 or 5 questions, you can guess that it is the P that we're talking about. We also, of course, look at other languages, not just English. And we finish up with a detailed examination of the syllable. And then, before the exercises, this chapter and the next 2 chapters have a sort of a how-to section that guides the student very carefully on how to determine whether something is a phoneme in a particular language other than the person's own language. So we use Brazilian Portuguese, we give a set of data, and we ask them look for minimal pairs, and then so you've discovered these are the phonemes, now move on to the ones that don't have minimal pairs, and we guide the student to determine a series of consonants and vowels in Brazilian Portuguese and show them how to do it. And that's followed by examples. Okay, the second section is called Structure and Meaning, and it starts with morphology. And it has the basic concepts of how different types of morphemes, roots and bases, and inflection and derivation, and complex words and compound words, etc. That is standard, I think, for every book. It has, as an example, I wanted to, on page 121, there's an Eyes on the World Languages that show how a free morpheme in English, a word that can be on its own, such as speak, in other languages is a bound morpheme, including in a language that is so familiar to everybody, such as Spanish, where every verb is actually, the root of every verb is a bound morpheme. In other words, every, let's say, infinitive verb in Spanish is made up of 3 morphemes at least. So that gives you an idea of how we try to incorporate other languages. The morphology has many tables with examples of both derivational and inflectional morphemes. And then again, the chapter ends with a how-to section in which actually there are 2 appendices on this. One is how to identify roots and morphemes in other languages. And in this case, we used the past tense morphemes in Spanish. And then the second one is how to build trees and diagrams to represent words. And then it goes on to the exercises. The next chapter in the same part is syntax, and we go through again the basic concepts. We look at ambiguity and how you determine whether the constituent structure of a sentence. And an example of an eyes on the world is on page 169, where it shows how a sentence in English can actually be a complex word in another language, such as Inuktitut in this case. One of the new things I think that is different in this chapter from most textbooks is that we are very particular in teaching the students the difference between an adjunct, something that is not necessary to the sentence, and something that is a complement. I think that's important because a lot of linguistics is built on what a complement is. The other thing that we differed is that we try to use current linguistic theories, such as the determiner phrase, in a way that is more in line with what you will find in most articles on the subject. Of course, we do try to simplify, but I always thought to myself, we're going to try to simplify and generalize, but not lie to the students and tell them something that nobody actually accepts anymore. Then we use the export template is what we show how you can represent both complements and adjuncts in a different way. Then again, the moment, for example, we introduce this is how you build a noun phrase, there will be a pause and reflect that shows them. So on page 185, for example, they're given a sentence, that kid stole my muffin, and asked to build the tree for it because that they have just learned the basics. But right on, immediately it says, well, first do this. First project muffins, and then add this, and third step do this, and the student is taken through it very carefully, and then at the end they are given another sentence and told, now follow the same steps to build this other tree. So we're great believers in paper and pencil and practicing doing it. So I've had students that do that on a computer, which is very surprising because it takes me an hour to do a tree on a computer. Anyway, we also end here with an appendix with a detailed explanation of how to analyze a sentence, both a declarative sentence and then how you turn it into a question. In this part, the final chapter is semantics. That has the basic, again, concepts such as the notation, connotation, reference, sense. And this is written by somebody who has done a great deal not only on semantic analysis, Rumiana Slovakova, but also on the second language acquisition of semantic context. One of the concepts that is new to this chapter is the distinction between an accusative and an ergative. Which we think is important, and because it shows students that what you hear is not necessarily what you get. And then there's a very beautiful explanation about spectral differences, how some words and some sentences may have an end point which is implicit, and other sentences don't, or verbs. And this is important not only from the point of view of semantics, but it's also important, for example, if you're teaching a second language or learning a second language, because many languages, in fact, as I understand it, all languages in the world have a way of expressing aspect, and aspect is very important to the interpretation. Okay, so then we move to part 4. Part 4 is titled Language Typologies and Change, and it includes 2 chapters that are very tightly linked, classification of languages and historical linguistics. And of course, classification of languages gives a sort of horizontal approach to languages, while historical linguistics is vertical, the history of languages. So the two, in a way, form a unit because they're in part 4, but they're separate chapters actually written by separate specialists. So I'd like to point out, for example, in the classification of languages, the author tries to show how the different ways in which different approaches to classifying languages and how none of them is actually perfect. So, but it does try to, at the same time, show that there is evidence, very strong evidence, when we say that languages are classified together. So it compares 3 Romance languages and the same sentence in 3 Romance languages, and shows the similarities in word order, in roots, etc., and then compares with Hebrew and Russian and Hungarian, showing how they are not at all similar to the Romance cases, how actually we are dealing with something that is real and not something that has been totally made up. Then the linguistic tidbit, then, for example, that is interest, we haven't given an example of a tidbit, is how Romance, Romanian, and Romani are not all, the Romance and Romanian are both first not related to Romantic, but related to Rome, and that Romani is a language that is the language of a people called Roma that call themselves, which means the people, and that sort of thing we think attracts students to this. And then the beautiful illustrations, for example, language families are illustrated with a series of matryoshka dolls, one inside the other. And the same thing in the historical linguistics links many of the changes that you see over time to what students have learned in phonetics and phonology about the processes that are universal in language. And I think I will stop there, and John will take over for the next 4 sections.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joyce. So now we're moving out of the theoretical portion of the book and more towards kind of the applied area of linguistics. And starting in chapter 5, part 5. Part 5 talks about language and social aspects. It includes 3 chapters. The first one is sociolinguistics. And the majority of this chapter addresses language variation and the factors that influence how people speak and what things motivate or prompt people to modify their speech depending on what situation they find themselves in. And that's chapter 9. Chapter 10, a related chapter, is specifically on pragmatics and discourse analysis. It's a little bit shorter chapter than the others by maybe 1,000 words or so, but we felt it was really important to include it in the actual textbook itself. There are other textbooks that have pragmatics as a portion of the sociolinguistics chapter, or it may be found online, or it may not be addressed at all. But we find that this is an area that students really, they seem keen to learn more about. And this pragmatics and discourse analysis chapter familiarizes readers with language, meaning, and society, along with different genres, styles of discourse. And the last chapter in this section is chapter 11. It looks at writing systems in society, and it takes a step back to history and looks at how writing first emerged in humans and how it was used, why it was used, and across time, how our writing has changed since the beginning. The chapter talks a little bit about reading as well. Then we move into part 6, which looks at how language is acquired. Chapter 12 is the first of the 2 chapters. Chapter 12 is looking at how we acquire a first language, including how sound, vocabulary, morphology, syntax, and communication, like discourse, how all of these things develop from birth. Actually, we even start from the womb before birth and talk about how acoustically, although it's not the best acoustic situation, a baby in the womb is still hearing language sounds. So we talk about that and how that leads to certain phonological development, and we go across the throughout childhood. In that chapter, we also look at things like the critical period for language acquisition, how humans have this innate ability or innate set of knowledge for language. And also unique to this chapter, I think, is we'll look at how atypical language can develop, things with autism, other types of disorders. And the chapter ends with bilingual first language acquisition. So those who are growing up from the very first days of speech with 2 languages. And chapter 13, the next chapter in this section, looks at second language acquisition. Once again, we go back and look at how sounds and words and structure develop and emerge in a second language. And we also look at how teaching can be used, how teaching pedagogies can help facilitate how languages are learned for adolescents and adults. And I think the chapter makes evident that learning a second language is certainly affected, and you probably know this, by many factors, not only internal to the learner, such as their age or their gender, but other external factors that they, society or the bilingual environment they find themselves in may contribute to their learning. The last section of the paper version of the book, which we should have showed you that at the beginning, I guess, right? So here's the book, but the paper version of the book contains 15 chapters, and that last part of the book has two chapters. And then, as I mentioned before, there are 3 brief chapters that are on the website. But this last part of the book looks at language, cognition, and the brain. So we start off in chapter 14, looking at how psycholinguistics, looking at what psycholinguistics does and how we process sounds, words, and sentences using our computer up here. The chapter also considers innovative methods, like how it is we measure language processing. We also take a look at how the bilingual mind handles more than one language. So how is it that we are able to switch back and forth between languages? Because nowadays, bilingualism, and it has been the case for some time actually, bilingualism is more a norm than an exception. So it is really important for us to address these bilingual issues throughout the book. The last chapter in the paper book is chapter 15, Neurolinguistics, which, like the psycholinguistics chapter, starts off with the basics. I know that was an advanced question that had been sent, is whether psycholinguistics and the neurolinguistics chapter will give the basic information needed to set up how language processing works. So yes, we first start off by processing information in psycholinguistics, and then we move to processing language. The same goes for neurolinguistics. We start by looking at the basic anatomy of the brain before we then move into where language is found in the brain. It's not the same across everyone, of course, but we talk about that in the chapter as well. And the chapter ends off with looking at some methods and technologies that can be used to study language in the brain, all the way from lesion studies and autopsies to neuroimaging and measures of electric and magnetic fields. And the very last topic of that chapter is always of interest to students and of me as well, is what happens to language when there is some sort of neurological trauma. It could be an onset like a stroke, or it could be a degenerative disease like dementia. And we take a look at what happens to language when certain areas of the brain are affected and what can clinically be done to rehabilitate those impairments. And I want to finally just mention those 3 brief chapters that are found on the book's accompanying website. Chapter 16, and someone asked about this as well, the animal communication and language. It begins with a discussion of how animals communicate. And it talks about specifically the signals that they use, not necessarily about apes learning vocabulary words and pressing a button to regenerate those words, but it looks at other species of animals such as prairie dogs and how they have like 8 different calls to signal what type of predator is coming, or the honeybee dance. So we look at language in animals based on their communicative signals that they make. Chapter 17 looks at how computers and humans interact through language. And the last chapter, 18, takes a look at how English became a world language and how it has many, many different varieties outside of North America that are able to, that allow us to create typologies, not only from what we saw in our typology chapter, but we can do that for just English, the language English. We can take a typology of that. So I think we've done plenty of talking, and I know there are some questions that are coming up here. So I do want to stop and open this up for some questions that you may have. And I'll read the first one because I know you can't see the questions, but a really good question is, what do you see as the main teaching challenges in introductory linguistics? And how does this particular textbook resolve those challenges? Joyce, do you want to, since I just was talking, I'm going to take a drink of water. Do you want to tackle that one?
Well, I'll try to, yes. I think one of the main challenges is that people have a lot of preconceived ideas about what language is, particularly their language. So, for example, teaching them that grammaticality from a linguist point of view is not necessarily the same thing. To give you an example of the Labov experiment, many people that speak English would say, yeah, but not pronouncing the R, that is terrible. And you can point out, well, but British English and Boston English doesn't pronounce the R. In fact, I don't pronounce the R, so that's something. The other thing that I think is that linguistics, first you have to learn a great many concepts, and it's quite theoretical, even in what look like applied areas such as second language acquisition. So there's a lot of theory and a lot of basic concepts that have to be mastered. And I think our book helps solve this by using different learning methods. We've all read about different personalities, how one person has to manipulate symbols, another person has to read, another person has to hear. And in the book, you are going to find a variety of approaches that I think are directed at different learning styles. And also, it's very strong on hands-on approach. So as John pointed out at the beginning, in particular, the pause and reflect sections give the students time to think about something, to discuss it, or even to actually take pen and pencil and analyze. So I think that is one of the advantages of our book. I don't know if John has anything to add to that.
No, I think the hands-on and the ability to be able to check those answers that they're doing in those pause and reflects, because they can just click over to the book's website and see indeed that they're on the right track before getting to those exercises at the end.
Yeah.
Another question is a very good question. Where can you find the table of contents? I noticed, it's a good question, because I noticed when you go to the website, www.cambridge.org/introducing Linguistics. The table of contents actually isn't on there, but if you do click on the Buy the Book button, I was just told this morning, because I asked this very question, if you click on the Buy the Book button, it'll take you to a preview of the book, which is, it'll show you the preface and the entire first chapter, including the table of contents. So do take a look at that. I'm sorry that it's kind of buried out there somewhere. You can also click on Amazon or somewhere and take a look at a sample of the preview of the book. Does the textbook assume any prior knowledge? It's a very good question. I definitely think no. There are textbooks out there, or there are universities out there that have an intro to language course, and they also have an intro to linguistics course. And from my understanding, one of them is set up for non-linguistics majors, and one is set up for linguistics majors. I could envision this particular textbook being used in both of those courses, because it is not something where you have to have had some prior knowledge to do well with. Joyce, do you agree with that?
Yes, I think so. I mean, different universities do different things. I know some universities, for example, have a different course for the first part, and the second part would be a continuing course. So I think that is up to the instructor.
Yeah. Here's another question about the information in the textbook on speech disorders and how we address that and guide readers towards understanding it. There are a few places in the textbook, including chapter 2, Phonetics, and also chapters 14 and 15, Psycholinguistics and Neurolinguistics, that all talk about speech disorders. We also look at dyslexia, dysgraphia, and stuff like that. And there's even a delving deeper, those little, if you want to know more about speech disorders, click here, and it takes you to the book's website, and there's an entire reading on that I wrote. So I think it's definitely, I thought it was important to include. A lot of textbooks don't, because yeah, you do have intro to speech language path, you have other textbooks that do that for you. But this, I always have lots of students in my intro to linguistics course who want to be speech language pathologists. And I thought that this is essential to have this in here, because I know that lots of students are interested in it. Our editor is going to send, afterwards, she'll send you this recording of the webinar, and she'll also include the table of contents with that email. Let's see. There's a question here I don't know I don't have an answer for, I'll be honest. Do you have any advice for adopting the textbook to teach remotely? That is nowadays we teach on Zoom and we do all the, and I have had to recently do that with all the textbooks I use, and each one is slightly different in how you use them. I think the good thing about this book is that it does come in an e-book that has the hyperlinks. Like if you want to know the definition of a word that's in bold, you can click and it automatically goes to the glossary. So in some ways, it may be used better than other books that aren't an ebook version when teaching remotely. But that is that's a challenge ongoing for all of us in these days. Sorry,
Yeah.
Joy.
I just was thinking about this when I saw the question, and it seems to me it could be used in terms of what is called a flipped classroom. I don't know if people have heard of that. That actually the students would read the textbook before they come up to class, and class time will be dedicated to doing the pause and reflect and the exercises, and adding maybe exercises. That might be a good good way of doing it, because I do believe that it's clear enough. And of course, the students I very often force the students to bring questions. It was your homework is you read these pages and you bring me a question on it. Sometimes the questions are pretty silly, but sometimes they're really important questions that you can address, and that sort of thing. So instead of explaining and then having them read at home, which seems to be what one usually does, or do the exercises at home, I think the textbook would be easily adaptable to a flipped classroom.
Yeah, yeah. There was another question here on what other freely available materials would be included with the textbook, like YouTube videos. There are lots of links throughout the textbook. Unfortunately, you know, those links, you can never guarantee that they're going to be the same link for more than a couple years or a couple months sometimes. But even on the book's website, though, there are a lot of websites, resources that can be then clicked on and go to. There are some YouTube videos as well, the links that are in the, we do the one on the McGurk effect, where you see a video, you hear it, and then you think it's doing something else, and then they remove the audio and it looks like they're saying something else, but it's been saying the same thing the whole time. Yeah, those are always fun for students, and they definitely are included throughout all of the chapters.
Yes, and actually, if you want, the Linguistics Society of America website has a list of websites that can be accessed as well. Some of them that are very interesting.
How do you think the student resources improve their learning experience? So the student resources, I think this might be asking about those pedagogies we're talking about, those, or perhaps you're asking about the exercises as well. I think maybe I hope you're talking about the pedagogies. These are the resources that are within the book. I really think that the pause and reflect, I hope that a student wouldn't just go over top of them, because as I read through it, I mean, I'm probably biased, but I'm going back now and reading through the entire thing, and I actually find them kind of interesting. This type of thing that says, do you know someone who does this? Or have you ever heard someone with this particular accent? What does that show you about the first language they may speak? You know, these reflection or practice, not only do they break up the text, because no one wants to sit there and see an entire page full of text, but they also, they really do, I think, improve the student learning experience. It's sort of a hold your hand every couple pages, let me check in with you sort of vibe, I think. And that's kind of the answer to the other question, how do you think the textbook stands out? And another thing that I think makes the textbook stand out, though, is that we're including, it's a new book, right? We're including these really sexy topics like, what are the cognitive benefits of bilingualism? Why is it that bilinguals are able to do things, let's say multitask, better than someone who only knows one language? These are current research areas that have only come around in the last 10 or 20 years and are very, very hot right now. So I think this is another thing that hopefully will make it stand out. It's more current. I think, are there any other questions? Because I think I've answered all the ones I see here.
Okay, thank you everybody for attending.
I think
thank you for organizing this.
Yes, thanks Cambridge University Press as well. And please do check out the website and then click somewhere else and take a look at the table of contents and read chapter 1 if you're interested. And always send me an email as well, or Joyce. My email is the letter J, and then my last name, which is SCHWIETER, J Schwieter, at WLU.ca. I'd be happy to answer any more questions you have as well. All right, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.